Hi, I'm Dr. Jonathan Downey. I'm a fully qualified conference and church interpreter working from English to French and from French to English. And recently I came across this half as interesting video called How the UN Translates Everything in Real Time. And I thought I'd give my reaction to it and give them some feedback on what the world is like outside of the UN. You see, I work in the commercial and church market, which is quite different to the world that they paint in that video. So
last week, as one does, I was peeping some UN pics and I noticed something. Big, boxy earpieces everywhere.
So those big boxy earpieces are really interesting because on what we call the private market, the market that isn't to do with international organisations or at least not intergovernmental organisations, you won't see these big boxy earpieces. Most of the ways that people listen to interpreting at, scientific conferences or at commercial events or even in churches look a lot more like the things I'm wearing just now. Those big boxy headsets were actually a surprise to me, but mostly you can listen to interpreting nowadays with whichever kind of device you like to listen to stuff. I will say that interpreting earpieces, for some reason, the ones that are connected to the receivers that you see at commercial events tend to only have one earpiece. I'm not entirely sure why that is. Maybe someone in the AV industry can tell me why they only put one earpiece. But that was the first surprise and the first interesting difference.
Do these plug you into the Illuminati mainframe?
Yes, they kind of do plug you into the Illuminati.
Diplomat? Is T-Swift farming streams in the Security Council? I put my outside correspondent Amy on the case and turns out, no. Instead, these things are how diplomats get reliable, real-time translations for every sentence spoken on the UN floor. But where do those
Yeah, kind of. He's going to correct himself later. I want to say it isn't possible to get real-time translation, because translation is what happens after the document is written, after the film is filmed. That's translation. Interpreting is what happens during events. So he's going to correct himself later and he's going to do a fairly good explanation of the difference between translation and interpreting. But no one can give you real-time translation because that's not what translation is. But anyway, let's keep going.
Translation come from? Whose voice is in the earpiece and how do they do it so fast? The first thing you need to know is that the UN has 6 official languages: Arabic, British, English, French, Mandarin Chinese, Russian, and Spanish. That means,
so again, this is the difference. In the private market, there are no such things as official languages. It's whichever languages the event needs. I've been at what's called a European Works Council, where you get executives and union representatives together, and the languages of that event are whichever languages are needed. So it could be French, Italian, German, Chinese, it doesn't matter. Likewise, I've done an event at the Scottish Parliament where the 2 languages for interpreting were Chinese and French. On the what we call the private market, official languages don't exist. It's whatever languages that organisation needs to use.
Another things that if you're sitting at a meeting in the General Assembly, anything you read or hear will be available to you in all 6. All 6 are in play. Every seat in the GA and Security Council, from the nosebleeds to the big ones, has a earpiece and some little buttons you hit until you hear your language of choice, or the ever mysterious...
So again, this is a private market, what we call institutional market difference. I've done private market conferences, so think scientific conferences or people showing off technology. I've done conferences like that where hardly anyone has any earpiece at all. On the private market, whoever's running the sound and whoever's making sure that the interpreters get good sound will have a bank of headsets, if you like. And these headsets plug into a little box, and you carry that little box around with you, and that little box receives a signal which gives you the interpreter's voices. You don't get wired in interpreting into seats outside of the institutional market in most places. And also, in the institutional market, everyone has access to interpreting, so it seems like a lot of people use it all the time. On the private market, it depends. I did one event on demolition where everyone was absolutely reliant on the interpreting to get anywhere at all and to get anything done. And equally, I've interpreted at events where there was a bank of headsets there and no one took any. So that's just how life goes. But wired in seats already wired to the interpreting system, that is really very much an institutional thing.
known, which I'm guessing is either Simlish, Toddler, or Marshmallow in mouth. The disembodied voice you'll hear isn't actually that far away. In fact, you can see them from where you're sitting. The interpretation booths
Again,
are...
on the private market, you can usually see where the interpreters are as well, if they're there with you. These are institutional booths. The private market booths they look a lot more like something out of IKEA. They do the job really, really well. They're a lot more mobile. And you can see their booths there. They're really obvious and you can see them. But also on the private market, and even I guess sometimes on the institutional market, interpreters can work remotely, which means they're not even in the room. I have some clients that I've worked with who have been literally thousands of miles away from them, and we'll talk about them later, working from rooms like this one, pretty much here.
Right up here, each labeled with their language. There are industry standards for just about everything inside. The lighting, the air circulation, the soundproofing, how comfortable the chairs are. But a copy of that standard costs 96 Swiss francs for some reason, so we're gonna live without the
industry standards are a whole thing. The industry standards are wonderful and important, and we really need properly made interpreting booths. But if you're on the private market, you might not always be in a big posh conference centre. Or a hotel, you might be in a field where tractors are driving by, or in a muddy test track where you get massive dumper trucks driving past you. Or you might be in a tent, or you might be watching something get tested, or you might be doing a factory tour. So those standards are great and important, and when you have interpreting booths, they have to be at that standard. But if you're on the private market, if you're outside of the institutions, you adapt to the conditions that you have, and you learn, how do I interpret a factory tour? How do I interpret when people are going down through a distillery? How do I interpret in different situations? I don't have a copy of the industry standards. I've never bought them. I think they're important and they have their place. But in the private market, you might not be in a booth all day. In fact, one job I did involved 4 different types of interpreting in the same day. We did simultaneous interpreting, like the ones you see at the UN, only we had no equipment, so we were literally whispering into people. We interpreted conversations, and I interpreted on stage, and we also took notes for that form of interpreting. You did everything in one day. So one of the great things about going to interpreting school is that you should learn all of these different forms of interpreting, how to handle yourself on a stage, how to handle yourself when you have to take notes, how to do dialogue interpreting. If you're learning all these skills, you're becoming a much more rounded interpreter, and you can handle whatever the private market can throw at you.
Each booth must always have at least 2 interpreters inside, which, by the way, is the word we should be using here. Translators, in this context, handle written stuff, while interpreters do the blabbing. Anyway, every interpreter in the...
this is where he's 95% correct, and I want to give him 9 out of 10 because many translation and interpreting professionals actually get this wrong. The best definition is that translation comes along after something is finished, so after you've written the document or the website or edited the film, and then gives you the version in the other language. Interpreting happens during the event, so translation can happen in written languages like English, French, Spanish, or sign languages. You can get sign language translation. Interpreting equally happens during the event, where things are ongoing, where people are still talking, where you're in the middle of the doctor's appointment and so on, or during the event or the consultation or whatever it is. Interpreting, therefore, can happen in spoken languages or sign languages. The amount of people who forget that sign languages exist, that sign language to sign language interpreting exists, that sign language translation exists, is kind of crazy. But it's important to realise that it's not just a spoken versus written thing. Sign languages exist, and we're much better talking about finished versus during. And by the way, if you wonder why my mic's at the back of my head, I actually have a better quality mic here, so I don't use that one, and it just gets in my way otherwise.
When is a native speaker of their booth's language, i.e. they interpret into the language they know best, since it takes more language mastery to communicate your thoughts than to understand someone else's. Someone staffing the French booth...
This is commonly said in interpreting circles, and commonly taught in interpreting circles. The research doesn't necessarily support this. In kind of Central and Western Europe, interpreters are taught that you're always better off interpreting into your native or first language. We now prefer to say first language rather than native language. If you want to know why, just ask me and I'll do a video on that. And basically from kind of Poland west, everyone was taught that. In Eastern Europe and in the Russian tradition, they were taught the opposite. They were taught you're better at interpreting into your second language or into your second language. And the research doesn't quite prove either way. What we do know is your understanding is almost certainly going to be better in your first language, and perhaps your production will be. That may or may not be the case. But equally, when you're interpreting into your second language, or your B language, as conference interpreters call it, you will tend to have fewer options available, so you might interpret more efficiently. And equally, if you're interpreting into your B language, your second language, then we know that you're going to understand the original a lot better than if you were interpreting into your first language. So although what he's saying is correct by some people's standards, the research says, yeah. And personally, about 70 to 80% of my own practice has been into French rather than into English. That's just what the market needs here. So, good suggestion, half as interesting. I don't know if you realise that you picked up something very controversial that the interpreting experts are still discussing.
For example, either grew up speaking French, went to school in French, or both. If a diplomat's speaking Spanish, the French interpreter spits it out in French. If she's speaking French, the folks in the French booth go chill mode while the other 5 interpret. The UN tends to staff the booth.
Just because you're not an active interpreter does not mean that you're in chill mode. Because, and this is remarkably common, if you lose your attention where your language is being spoken and you think, I don't need to interpret anymore, assuming you get the chance to do that on the private market, the likelihood is you're going to be interpreting most of the time. But say there was a reason why you didn't need to interpret. If you're not paying attention to what the speaker's saying, perhaps even taking notes, when you do become active again, and the next speaker says, as the speaker from Spain was saying, you're in trouble. This is why interpreters have very strictly limited shifts. It's also why good interpreters are always aware. I mean, we'll take breaks when we go off shift, we'll go to the toilet and get a drink and so on. But good interpreters during a job won't switch off. Because the very time that you switch off is the very time something is said that someone references in the speech that you're about to interpret. It happens all the time, trust me. So chill mode, yeah, means you're not physically speaking. But I would expect you, if you're in a booth with me especially, I would expect you to be paying attention still, because you never know what can happen when you're not physically interpreting.
Booths such that each one can cover at least 3 of these 6 official languages. So the Russian booth, for example, might contain 2 lifelong Russian speakers, both of whom can understand English, one of whom can understand French, and one of whom can understand Chinese. But what happens if someone on the floor is speaking a language a booth doesn't have covered? What if someone's
just before we go into relay, I want to explain this is another difference between the private market and the institutional market. On the private market, most of the interpreting that I've seen, the booths are all two-way booths. So C languages, so languages that you can understand and you can interpret from but not into. On the private market, they're certainly in the UK, they're not really that useful. We would much rather that you have 2 languages that you can interpret between. And every booth then is capable of doing two-way. And whoever needs to go into English just goes into English. They take the English channel over and that's it. There isn't a dedicated English booth. The Italian booth can go into English. The Spanish booth can go into English. The French booth can go into English and so on. The institutions work very differently because they have a much wider number of languages to cover. And also they have long-standing practice that they're used to doing it this way. On the other hand, relay, which we're about to come to, that's very common on the private market.
in Arabic and nobody in the Spanish booth understands it, and vice versa. In this case, they employ what's called a relay system. Maybe there aren't any Arabic-Spanish interpreters, but there is a Spanish interpreter that knows English. So an Arabic interpreter would exit chill mode and interpret the speech from Arabic to English for the person in the Spanish booth, who would then interpret that from English to Spanish, so when you turn your earpiece to Spanish, you'd hear an interpretation of a speech, all in near real time. This happens pretty often.
Yes. And relay is incredibly common. So I did a European Works Council once where the speaker at one point was speaking Italian. That Italian was turned into English by the excellent Italian booth. Then my booth, the French booth, turned that English into French. If you're doing relay, and if you're that interpreter in the middle, we call them the pivot. If you're pivot, you realise that you're not just interpreting so that the audience can understand, you have to interpret in such a way that an interpreter can then interpret it. In a sense, it makes life easier because interpreters know what kinds of things interpreters like to interpret and what kind of language patterns are easier to interpret. So if you're pivot, you better be aware of what it takes to deliver excellent interpreting for other interpreters. On the other hand, if you're pivot, you're aware that you're carrying more of the meeting than you would normally be expected to. So I have seen it where booths will arrange pivot duty if they get the chance. They'll arrange pivot duty for people who are more comfortable doing it. But every interpreter who's trained should be able to deliver excellent relay because it's part of the job. It's what we're called to do.
English-Spanish interpreters are a dime a dozen, but what about Russian Spanish, Arabic Spanish, Chinese French? Those are unicorns. In fact, the UN needs a relay system so often when interpreting from Arabic and Chinese that all the interpreters who work in those two booths must be able to interpret both into their language, like normal, and out of it for relay purposes. This means there are
Guess what? That's expected on the UK private market, that you'll be able to interpret in both directions. I was blessed at the university I went to, offered a way that you could practice interpreting in both directions, and that's the way that I did it.
3 people in those booths instead of 2, and that they very rarely get to experience chill mode. As far as I can tell, the UN keeps about 120 interpreters in their full-time staff, and they're tough spots to get. The UN only offers exams for each language combination roughly every 3 years, and you need a lot of qualifications to even take one.
See, one of the things that isn't mentioned there is actually having a degree in interpreting can really help, not just because you've got specific interpreting training, but also because when you do a degree in interpreting, you gain a network of people who know about interpreting. And those qualifications to get to the UN are really tough. I know someone who actually got a UN spot after doing her PhD in interpreting. But equally, if you want to be on the private market, you have to know who has the jobs, you have to know other interpreters, sometimes you have to know interpreting agencies and so on, you have to be trusted. Where the official qualifications might not technically be as strict, although kind of they are, in reality, it's just as strict. And it's a lot based on your relationships and your reputation and how many people know you and trust you. That's what it comes down to.
And if you ace it and nail all the following tests and interviews, you get a 2-year appointment, after which they'll either promote you or let you go. You can also land amongst the freelancers, the people the UN calls upon when they don't have enough interpreters around to cover what they have going on. Fun fact, freelance interpreters at the UN make a devilish $666 a day, which I know because I read.
I'm not going to tell you exactly what freelancers make because what we make can depend on the job. I've had one project which paid substantially more than others because of what was required in the job. But I will say that here in the UK, the rates aren't always like that. It really depends who you're working for, whether you're going through an agency, whether you're going directly, what the end client is like, and so on. So that's a good rate of pay. And keep your eye out if you're starting out as an interpreter. Keep your eye out for people offering rates of pay substantially below what your colleagues advise you to take. As soon as you start offering an interpreter, get to know people in your local area and nudge them and say, what's the standard day rate down here? What kind of rates do you get? So we're not allowed to fix rates on the private market at all. But we are certainly allowed to kind of nudge colleagues and say, what do standard rates look like? And a good colleague will say it depends on the job, but they should give you an indicator of the range that you should be looking for.
UN and the Interpreters Association 34-page freelance employment agreement for fun, and I didn't even have to fork over 96 Swiss francs for the privilege. From 1984 to 1985, the only year for which I could find the stat I wanted, the UN spent a total of $78 million on interpretation, equivalent to over $235 million today. But of course interpretation is expensive. Being able to tune in live to what's being said in front of you in a completely different language than the one being spoken is basically magic. Mind you, when some guys...
Yes and no. It's strange to people who aren't used to it. If you go through interpreting school, you can actually see very quickly who's going to manage it and who isn't. There are some people who are fully bilingual, they've been brought up bilingual, and you ask them to do simultaneous interpreting and their brain just goes and they can't do it. On the other hand, there are specific techniques that if you learn them and if you ingrain them at interpreting school, you're going to do well. And actually the technique that we don't speak about enough is reading the room. In the UN, I guess, is more difficult, but on the private market, being able to read how well things are being understood, how well people are catching what's being said, and whether the techniques that you're using are working for that audience are really important. You have to be able to have this instinct, this view of how is it going to come across? Are these people taking this in? Do I need to change the way I'm interpreting this? Some assignments is great because you can see people's faces and you can go, okay, I need to reword that the next time it comes around, or I need to do something different here. Reading the room and adjusting to how people are understanding is really important. And incidentally, it's probably one of the few skills that sets human interpreters absolutely apart from the machines, because we understand emotion, we understand people, we can tell if things aren't working.
Did it in the Bible, it counted as a miracle. They made it a holiday.
Yes, when they did it in the Bible, it did count as a miracle, and my book, Multilingual Church, actually talks about that in chapter 2. But there we go.
Now interpreters do it every day, and where's their holiday? Well, the first Wednesday in May actually, but what are you doing to celebrate? Doing a live interpretation demands a combination of preparation, skill, and instinct. To prep,
yes, and this is why we keep asking for notes from speakers, and if you're being interpreted, can I sit down? Anyone who's going to be interpreted, whether it's in church, whether it's at a conference, wherever it is, please, I'm going to stare down the camera lens for this, please never read from a manuscript. Use notes instead. If you're reading like this, it's not going to work. It's going to be horrible. Every speaker that I've ever interpreted who's read from a manuscript has ignored the audience and has been a boring reader. It makes interpreting much easier if you're natural, if you're yourself, and if you're relaxed. So yes, it takes preparation, yes, it takes skill. It does take a certain amount of instinct, although familiarity with the setting helps you with that. But yeah, and there are a few other things I want to add in a minute.
Get some advanced information about the meeting they're covering. They'll know the subject matter and niche jargon they may come across, plus they get advanced copies of the documents attendees will have. And
not always. At the UN, I should hope they always get them. On the private market, well, I did an assignment once where the only speech which didn't, in fact, the only set of PowerPoint slides that didn't arrive in advance was a detailed discussion of American jurisprudence and law on a certain subject, with all the laws named and numbered. Yes, that was interesting, to put it mildly. So please, if you're working with interpreters, please send us stuff in advance. We're not doing it to make life difficult for you. We're doing it because it helps us give better interpreting, which means that your audience react better, which means they like you better. Send us stuff in advance, please.
Even a copy of the speeches people are planning to deliver. They're trained to understand every regional accent of the language they're interpreting from, and they know how to maintain...
I have a story about that, actually. I was interpreting a meeting on deep sea fishing policy, and the chair of the meeting asked if he could listen to the French because the specific accent from Scotland he thought would be so hard to understand. So yes, we can do accents. Yes, universities, when they're training you to do interpreting, will train you with accents. And if you've done your training, you can recognise when the interpreter is being trained on accents because they have that look on their face which is, oh no.
Perfect delay between when the speaker is talking and when they start interpreting. They need to delay enough that they can understand people's full idea before they start repeating it, but if they delay too much, they might give themselves too much to recall from short-term memory while also trying to listen to what the speaker is still saying. The rest is instinct.
Yes, except most professional interpreters are trained to do things like summarising, we're trained to catch up, we're trained to manage our lag. This is called lag, or EVS if you're doing research, ear voice span. We manage it, we lengthen it, we shorten it, it depends on the speaker. It's not a fixed thing.
Interpreters have to match their speaker's tone and anticipate the end of their sentences to keep up pace. They can't ask speakers to slow down or repeat themselves, they just have...
Sometimes on the private market you can, depending on the setup. If you're working in simultaneous like they do at the UN, no, you can't ask for stuff. Some consoles where we interpret have a button that says slow down, but it doesn't do anything. It never does anything. I think it's just for us to press to feel better, really. But in some circumstances, you can talk to speakers, and we will often try to chat to speakers in advance so that they know that we're there. But yeah, it's difficult.
To nail it and keep listening. Also, this is all happening at about 120 words per minute, as fast as an average Biden State of the Union. Neurologists are still trying to figure out exactly how they do it, but one study found that...
So there's a really good video, which I'll link in link in the description to this one, where someone talks through the neurology and the brain science of interpreting, and the answer is, yeah, we're still figuring it out. But there's a lot of good brain science out there. It's not something that I specialised in, either in my training or in my PhD, but it's worth looking at. It turns out interpreting might be good for your brain if you don't do it for too long.
Doesn't just use the parts of the brain that processes language or talks, it draws on capacity from other parts of the brain that handle movement and stuff, just to coordinate all that listening, processing, interpreting, and speaking. And if that sounds exhausting to you...
And one more thing that he didn't realise that we do, we listen to ourselves when we're interpreting. Interpreters are constantly self-monitoring, and one of the differences between professional interpreters and amateurs is that professionals are trained to listen to themselves. And so we'll sometimes change the ends of our sentences or apologise for minor mistakes and so on, because that's what we do, we have to get it right.
Staff interpreters only cover 7 or 8 meetings, each 3 hours long per week. And during those meetings, they'll swap out with another interpreter every 20 to 30 minutes, lest they pucker their brain.
This is a staff versus private market thing. In the private market, we could do meetings, we will work for 7.5 hours a day, depending on the conference. We again do the 20 to 30 minutes, but there's nothing really to stop a private market interpreter doing 3 or 4 days of 7.5 hours at a time. If it works, I mean, I've done that myself. I did 1 week where I did 5 days of interpreting with a couple of days break in between, with a 2-day break in between. I've done 4-day events. That's just how the private market works. Now, admittedly, it could be longer between our assignments, but they're thinking about sustaining interpreters over the long haul. If you're a private market interpreter and you're busy, you probably have to keep an eye on your own health so that you don't overdo it. And the regulations are there for freelance interpreters too for a reason, so we might do more hours in a single week, but over our career I think the staffers will probably have a few more under their belt than private market interpreters will.
Out and threaten a country with juice and s'mores instead of nuclear wars. Because sure, little errors in the live interpretations get cleaned up before entering the record, but big errors just can't happen. I mean, it's the UN. There's almost nowhere that knowing exactly what someone else said matters more. So here's to you.
My court interpreting and medical interpreting colleagues would like to have a word with Sam about that one. I think it matters everywhere for different reasons. Obviously, no one's going to die if I accidentally misinterpret something in church. Someone might die if someone misinterprets something in a hospital. Someone might go to prison for the wrong reason if a legal interpreter interprets something wrong in a court. So, yeah, interpreting is high pressure. Often interpreting is happening in places where we can't get things wrong. And so that's why the regulations are there. That's why the recommendations are there. That's why we shouldn't be doing more than 20 to 30 minutes, because it makes your interpreting worse. But there we go.
UN interpreters up in your boxes, making diplomacy happen from the sidelines. You deserve some nuclear war. No, juice and s'mores. Man, I'm not cut out for this job. Killed him.
Thanks, Sam. So that was a pretty good, I would give it, 8.5, 9 out of 10. Really good representation of what happens at the UN. There's a lot more to interpreting than just the UN. Keep tuned to the channel for more videos coming up, talking about church interpreting, about interpreting in general. But thank you very much. And of course, since we're on YouTube, like and subscribe.